All right, let's talk about one of the most haunting and grotesque fates that can befall a psyker in the Imperium of man. It's not death in battle, not mutation by chaos, not even soul consumption by a warp predator. No, this is something far more insidious, something institutional, accepted, even systematic. I'm talking about the Choir of the Damned, a name that sounds like some forbidden myth, an ominous fragment from a lost heretical scripture. But no, it's very real. Hidden in the depths of Imperial infrastructure behind sealed doors and forgotten corridors, this so-called choir is a living monument to failure, silence, and psychic agony. See, when we think of the Imperium's use of psykers, most of us picture the heroic Astropaths, the blind, cloaked telepaths who endure soul-binding rituals to communicate across the stars. They're respected in their own grim way. Feared, yes, but necessary. But what we rarely talk about, or even acknowledge, is what happens to the ones who don't make it. The ones who flinch during the soul binding. The ones who scream when the Emperor's light is burned into their soul and never stop screaming. The ones who die or worse survive, but come out broken in ways no servo skull could ever catalog. And that's where the Choir of the Damned comes in. It's not a metaphor. It's a literal choir, composed of those psykers who were too damaged, too unstable, or too mutated to serve as astropaths, yet somehow still useful. And I don't mean that in a noble, redemptive kind of way. I mean useful the way a battery is useful, or a broken machine still has scrap metal value. These are people who've been deemed expendable, but not disposable. Living tools, placed into formation not to speak, but to scream, not to communicate, but to suffer in sync, their agony woven into psychic resonance that powers something. No one really talks about what exactly. And maybe it's better that way. The Imperium doesn't waste. That's one of its many sins. When you're dealing with an empire of 1,000,000 worlds constantly on the verge of collapse, every broken tool, every failed experiment, every ruined life has to be repurposed. You might think that being part of a choir sounds almost poetic, even beautiful. But here, it's a lie. There's no harmony in this song, only pain, only madness. Their voices don't rise in celebration, but in endless, dissonant shrieks echoing through the warp. This is a choir with no audience, no applause, only screaming. So why does this exist? Why does the Imperium let this happen? Better yet, why does it need to happen? What twisted logic governs the creation of the Choir of the Damned? These aren't questions many citizens of the Imperium ever get to ask, and if they did, they'd probably end up in the same catacombs as the choir itself, whispering secrets to the void with their last breath. But here's the truth. The Choir of the Damned is not a myth. It is a reality born of desperation, bureaucracy, cruelty, and cosmic necessity. And if you really want to understand the fate of failed astropaths, if you want to know what happens when you fall short of being a tool of the Emperor, you need to look into this pit of psychic horror with your eyes wide open. Because the Imperium doesn't care if you're broken. It only cares if you can still scream on key. If we're going to talk about the fate of failed astropaths, we first need to understand what an astropath really is. And I don't mean just the surface-level stuff you'll find in a Munitorum data slate or some half-sanitized Imperial primer. I'm talking about what it actually means to become one of these strange, revered, and tragically fragile psykers. Because you see, astropaths aren't just psychic messengers who send spooky thoughts across the galaxy. They are souls that have been utterly and permanently changed, burned, reshaped, and in many ways, hollowed out by something both sacred and horrifying. And this transformation is what separates them from the failed ones. It's the razor-thin line between being a revered servant of the Imperium and a screaming husk thrown into the Choir of the Damned. First off, not every psyker is eligible to become an astropath. In fact, the vast majority aren't. Most sanctioned psykers are simply too weak, too volatile, or too mad to be entrusted with the sheer weight of interstellar communication. The ones chosen for the soul-binding process, those are the elites. or at least they're supposed to be. They've already survived the horror show of black ships, the psychological scouring of Scholastica Psychina, and more tests and tortures than any mortal should endure. And then, when all that's done, they are led before the Golden Throne itself, or more precisely, into the presence of the Emperor's psychic shadow. This is where things get impossible to truly grasp. The soulbinding is often described in dry, academic language, a ritual in which the Emperor of mankind imprints a fragment of his divine essence onto the soul of the psyker, forging an unbreakable tether that protects them from the predations of the warp. But that's like saying a volcano is a source of heat. What really happens during the binding is more akin to an execution that somehow fails to kill you. The Emperor's presence sears away everything that isn't useful: fear, ego, memory, and sometimes even identity. You walk in as one person and crawl out as something entirely different. If you crawl out at all, and here's the thing that gets glossed over far too often, not everyone survives. And I don't mean dies in the usual sense. I mean some come out irreparably broken, their minds shattered, their souls scorched beyond recognition. Some emerge screaming, eyes burned out, clawing at their own flesh as if trying to peel away whatever horror they witnessed. Others are just empty. They breathe, they blink, they can even walk, but there's nothing behind the eyes. Like the Emperor looked into them and decided they weren't worth the effort. The reason the Imperium even goes through with this horrific process is simple. Without astropaths, the galaxy falls apart. Warp travel is already a nightmare, but without someone to send and receive messages through that madness, the Imperium would lose contact with its worlds in days. It would fracture into isolated, paranoid little bubbles, each one terrified of what lurks beyond the stars. Astropaths are the glue that holds everything together, one telepathic cry at a time. But that also means the pressure on each candidate is immense. You're not just being trained. You're being sculpted into a vessel for divine fire, and that fire doesn't always cooperate. There are cases, rare but documented, where a psyker's soul simply rejects the binding. They flail, they melt down, they even explode in waves of uncontrolled warp energy. And yet, even those who survive physically may not come through whole. Those are the ones who often end up in the choir. And this is where the heartbreak sets in, because those who fail the soul binding aren't necessarily weak. Sometimes they're just different. Their psychic frequency might be off by a hair, or their mind might resist the transformation in ways that can't be predicted. And yet, there's no second chance, no alternate path. Once you've been marked a failure, your fate is no longer yours to decide. You become property, data to be processed, flesh to be categorized. And if you're lucky, you're euthanized quietly. If you're unlucky, you're kept. One theory I've always found chilling comes from a fringe sect of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. They believe that some failed astropaths aren't failures at all, but too sensitive, that their souls were too pure, too psychically attuned, and that's why the binding shattered them. The Emperor's fire wasn't rejected. It was too much for them to contain. These individuals, according to the sect, aren't broken. They're overcharged. And if that's true, it means the choir isn't full of dregs. It's full of potential gods, silenced before they could awaken. But the Imperium doesn't care for such poetry. You're either a tool or you're raw material. There's no in-between. And that's what makes the soul binding so terrifying. Not just the process itself, but what it reveals about how little your worth matters if you can't perform. You're not judged on courage or loyalty or intellect. You're judged on your utility. And the moment that utility drops below a certain threshold, well, you might still be able to scream. And that's all they need from you. For now. The term failed astropath might sound clinical, like it's just a checkbox on some data slate in the Adeptus Astra Telepathica archives. But it's not. It's a sentence, a curse wrapped in bureaucratic language. And what's worse is that failure doesn't always look the same. Sometimes it's a silent collapse. Sometimes it's a firestorm of psychic feedback that takes out everyone in the chamber. The path to becoming an astropath is already narrow, but the ways in which it can all go wrong? They are countless. Physically, the human body is barely equipped to handle the rigors of even minor psychic strain, let alone the searing presence of the Emperor himself. During soulbinding, the psyker isn't just communing with divine energy, they're being reshaped by it. The skin cracks and blisters under invisible fire. Eyes boil away, not from heat, but from overwhelming visions they were never meant to see. Some candidates simply collapse, blood pouring from their ears as their nervous system shuts down under the pressure. Their hearts give out. Their brains seize. You'd think that would be the worst outcome. But death is mercy. Then there are the ones who survive the physical ordeal, only to be torn apart mentally. This is, in my opinion, the most horrifying failure of all. These are the ones who come back changed in ways you can't always see. They walk, they speak, sometimes even coherently, but there's something missing. Or worse, something added. The soul binding doesn't just fuse a psyker to the Emperor's light. It burns away their imperfections, their instability, their fear. But if that process goes wrong, what's left behind is like a house after a fire. The frame still stands, but inside, it's ashes. Some emerge with their minds so fragmented, they can't tell where they end and the warp begins. They'll whisper in dead languages, laugh at nothing, recite coordinates to places that don't exist. Or worse, they'll just stare for hours, days, as if they're seeing something behind the veil that no one else can. These are the ones the Telepathica tries to hide. They're not just failures, they're liabilities. Because what if that nothing they're looking at is actually something? What if something is looking back? And then there's the psychic angle. A failed soul binding can do more than break a mind. It can distort a psyker's connection to the warp in permanent, dangerous ways. Their psychic signals become jagged, chaotic. Instead of broadcasting clear messages, they radiate static, like screaming into a void filled with broken glass. Some of them develop uncontrolled telepathic leakage, unintentionally projecting their trauma into the minds of those around them. Others become psychic beacons, drawing predators from the immaterium like blood in the water. There are records of entire astropathic choirs being consumed from within because a failed psyker was left too close, leaking his nightmares into the chorus until everything unraveled. The scariest part? No one really knows why some psykers fail. Yes, there are obvious risk factors: mental instability, low willpower, insufficient training. But the process isn't mathematical. It's spiritual, and that means unpredictable. Some of the most stable, promising candidates burn out instantly, while a terrified wreck of a girl from a hive slum might emerge a full-fledged astropath. There's a theory, one whispered among some scholars of the Ordo Hereticus, that the Emperor chooses who lives and who fails based on some divine logic no mortal can grasp. That soul binding is not a ritual, but a judgment. Others reject that idea. They see it as dangerous mysticism. To them, the failures are just the natural consequence of pushing flawed biological beings into contact with energies far beyond them. We're talking about creatures who, despite all our spiritual trappings, are still just humans. Weak, fragile, scared little things trying to hold on to their identity while staring into the heart of divinity. Most of us wouldn't last a second. So maybe the failure rate shouldn't surprise anyone. Maybe the real surprise is that anyone survives it at all. I remember reading an account from an ex-guard medic who witnessed a failed soul-binding subject being removed from the chamber. The man had no eyes, no tongue, and his fingers were fused into fists, yet he was still twitching, still mouthing silent words. The guards handling him joked about it, called him the Emperor's typo. And that moment stuck with me because it said so much about how normalized this horror has become. That even the most grotesque, heartbreaking outcomes are just another part of the machinery, another screw that didn't fit. And yet, the Imperium doesn't throw these people away. Not out of mercy, never that, but because even the failed can still serve. Their psychic resonance, though flawed, can be aligned, tuned, used, like broken violins still capable of a single note. And that's where their path begins to curve toward the choir. Because if you can't be trusted to send messages, maybe you can still be part of something darker, something larger, something that screams in unison with 100 others, all trying to drown out the sound of their own failure. So what happens if you survive soulbinding, but don't quite make it to the other side as a full-fledged astropath? You don't die, but you're not whole either. You're caught in this strange liminal space between purpose and discard, between usefulness and ruin. This is the part that breaks me the most, because once you've looked into the light of the Emperor and faltered, you don't just go back to the barracks. There's no homecoming. There's no recovery. You become something else, a half-born thing. And the Imperium, efficient, brutal, indifferent, knows exactly what to do with things like you. For many of these failed candidates, the time immediately after the soulbinding is the most disorienting. Their minds are splintered, their bodies ravaged, and yet they are kept alive, monitored, probed, evaluated like malfunctioning cogitators. The Telepathica doesn't discard its investments lightly. Each of these psykers represents years of indoctrination, transportation, feeding, and training. Even in failure, there might be some value left to extract. And so, they're warehoused, that's the best word for it, stored, sometimes sedated, sometimes restrained, always watched. Some are left in isolated chambers, heavily warded, surrounded by thick plasteel and rows of servitors with neural cauterizers. Others are grouped together in what are essentially psychic quarantine wards, rows of twitching, broken figures who mutter and scream and weep in unison. You ever read those old accounts from Medici personnel who worked near these holding blocks? They talk about the walls being warm, not from heating, but from the residual psychic noise bleeding out. Like the walls themselves were sweating sorrow, and if that doesn't give you chills, I don't know what will. But here's the part I find even more disturbing. There's a window of time, days, weeks, sometimes longer, when no one knows exactly what to do with these individuals. They haven't been officially designated as useful or useless yet, so they wait, in limbo. You can imagine what that must feel like. You've survived something that kills most candidates. You've been touched by the Emperor, burned by divine fire, and instead of being celebrated as a survivor, you're tossed into a cell and forgotten. No one talks to you. No one comforts you. They're afraid of what you might do, or maybe what you might become. There's this tragic irony that so many fans bring up. The idea that the Emperor, this being of godlike power and supposed compassion, can scar a soul so deeply in the process of trying to protect it. That his light is so blinding, so intense, it breaks more people than it saves. And then, rather than helping those broken ones heal, the Imperium simply shelves them like faulty laser guns. There's no therapy, no attempt to mend what's been shattered. Only cold calculation. Can this psyker still be used for something, anything at all? And in some cases, the answer is yes, but not in the way you'd hope. Some of the failed are reassigned, moved to administrative databanks as barely conscious computation drones. Others are installed in astropathic relay stations to act as crude psychic amplifiers, plugged into circuits they don't understand, forced to resonate like human tuning forks. Their minds are no longer their own, if they even still have minds. A few particularly tragic examples have been found embedded in servitor shells, their psyker abilities linked to specialized augmetics. They're not dead, not entirely, but they're no longer people either, and let's not forget the ones who vanish altogether. There are whispers, always whispers, that certain failed soul-binding candidates are taken by the Inquisition, not for mercy killings, but for study. The Ordo Malleus, in particular, is said to have a keen interest in those touched by the Emperor, but not fully bound to him. Some theorize that these psykers might have seen deeper into the warp than even a proper astropath. that their trauma opened pathways no sane mind could walk. Whether any truth lies in those claims, we'll probably never know, and that, honestly, might be for the best. But even before any formal reassignment or transformation into choir members begins, these psykers suffer in the most basic human way, through abandonment. They're alone, forgotten. The same institutions that once praised their potential now pretend they don't exist. Imagine being trained your whole life for one sacred purpose, surviving the unthinkable, and being rewarded with silence and solitude. No wonder many of them lose the final fragments of sanity they had left. I've read reports, confiscated logs from rogue psykers, about candidates who spoke of angels and monsters visiting them in their cells. Not dreams, not hallucinations, actual presences. Visitors from beyond the veil, drawn to their damaged, flickering souls like vultures circling a dying animal. And yet, through all of this, they aren't destroyed. Not yet. That's the part that haunts me most. The Imperium could end their suffering. It has the tools, the methods. But it chooses not to. Because there is always a chance, even a small one, that these broken psykers can still serve. And that chance is enough to keep them breathing, barely, until the call comes. Until someone decides they're ready to be taken to the choir. To finally become part of something, even if that something is a chorus of screams echoing through the shadows of the Imperium. Eventually, the waiting ends. Not with salvation, not with healing, but with a new designation, an assignment scrawled across parchment or encoded in a servitor's data coils. The failed psyker is no longer pending evaluation. They're being transferred, reclassified, repurposed. That's the moment when their journey to the choir of the damned begins. And no, it's not a chaotic dumping ground for the broken and insane. This thing, this choir, is organized, calculated, a machine made of suffering, designed to sing exactly when and how the Imperium demands it. The decision to assign someone to the choir isn't made lightly or quickly. There's a chain of assessments, psychic potential re-evaluations, warp resonance pattern tests, purity scans, even theological consultation in some cases. Not because they care about the psyker, but because the choir serves a very specific function, and the wrong resonance could ruin everything. It's all about frequencies, psychic harmonics. You can't just throw a bunch of screaming psykers into a room and expect results. There has to be structure. And that's where the bureaucracy of the Imperium shines in all its cold, hideous brilliance. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica handles most of the paperwork, of course. They're the ones who decide which psykers are beyond recovery, but still potentially useful. Then come the Adeptus Administratum oversight clerks, who track resources, project outcomes, and loss ratios. And sometimes, disturbingly often, the Mechanicus gets involved too, particularly the ones from the Divisio Biologists or Lex Mechanic enclaves. They're not there to help the psykers. They're there to refine the system, optimize it, figure out how to get more juice from a lesser battery. Once selected, the psyker is stripped of any previous designation. Name, identity, training background, all erased. They're now a component, a voice, a resonance marker in a larger equation. They're transported, sometimes across entire sectors, to the hidden facilities where the choirs are maintained. These aren't pretty places. We're not talking about choir halls with vaulted ceilings and spiritual iconography. Think more like subterranean crypts, reinforced with psychically inscribed obsidian, walls humming with null energy. Places built to contain not just the physical, but the metaphysical. Inside, the psykers are arranged into groups, never randomly. There's a logic to the pairings, based on how their damaged psychic patterns interact with one another. Some need to be sedated constantly, others sing better when kept in a trance of pain or ecstasy. Yes, that's a real thing. Some choirs are actually maintained by keeping their members in a state of heightened agony, not because it's cruel, although, let's be honest, it is, but because pain sharpens the resonance. It amplifies the frequency. The Imperium learned that early on and never looked back. The choirs are divided by purpose. Some serve as navigational aids for astropathic relays, helping full astropaths align their signals across the warp. Others are used in warfare, tuned to broadcast screams that disrupt enemy psykers or to enhance sanctioned mind-scouring operations. There are even rumors of entire starships equipped with choirs built into their hulls, their songs weaponized like psychic artillery. I've heard stories about vessels that enter the immaterium and let their choir scream as a kind of sonar, mapping out the warp currents by how the echoes return. Creepy, right? But chillingly effective. What disturbs me most is that this isn't some rare, forbidden technology hidden away in the black libraries of the Inquisition. This is standard operating procedure in some regions of the Imperium. There are forge worlds that mass-produce the containment apparatus for choir members. Chairs embedded with nerve spike injectors, resonance cages, soul-dampening coils. There are administrators whose entire jobs revolve around rotating choir personnel, monitoring psychic burnout, and approving requisitions for fresh voices. That's what they call them. Voices, not people, never people. And yet, in the middle of this nightmarish machinery, you can still see echoes of who they were. The psykers don't forget completely. Some of them still murmur prayers. Some whisper the names they had before. Others sing lullabies from their homeworlds, their broken minds clinging to fragments of identity like flotsam on a tide of madness. And the choir keeps going, keeps resonating, keeps serving. Because in the Imperium, if you're still breathing and your skull hasn't imploded, there's always some way to be useful. There's a fan theory that really stuck with me. It suggests that the choirs are a reflection of the Imperium's theology, the idea that suffering is not just necessary but sacred, that by enduring pain, these psykers are achieving a kind of martyrdom. They're not damned, they're singing for humanity, holding back the darkness with every note. It's a beautiful idea, until you remember they never had a choice. No one asked them to sacrifice themselves. They were just deemed unfit and then forced to scream. Still, there's something about the choirs that lingers with you. Maybe it's the sheer scale of it all. The thought that across the galaxy, in thousands of hidden chambers, these broken souls are screaming in harmony. Not out of joy, not out of faith, but because they were told to. Because even in their failure, the Imperium found a way to use them. Efficient, ruthless, terrifying, and yet, undeniably, brilliant in its cruelty. The conditions under which the choir of the damned lives, if you can even call it living, are a level of horror that makes even the grim dark of Warhammer 40,000 feel colder than usual. This isn't some sanitized chamber where broken psykers are quietly maintained and given clean robes and nutrient paste. No, the choir is kept in places that don't just strip away identity. They erase the very idea that these people were ever human to begin with. The cells they're placed in aren't designed for comfort. They're not even really designed for survival. They're designed for containment. Null fields hum constantly, suppressing psychic outbursts, but also slowly grinding away at the mind. The walls are often embedded with wards, etched with phrases from the Book of Lorgar, ironically enough, meant to suppress warp resonance, but they end up creating an environment where every thought feels like it's being crushed under psychic weight. You ever try to think while being smothered by silence that isn't natural? That's what these people feel every second of their existence. Lighting is sparse, flickering, almost always cold blue or sickly green, just bright enough to see the outline of the person next to you, but never clearly. Choir members aren't kept in solitary. They're grouped, often packed into narrow alcoves like organs in a vast, silent instrument. And while that might sound poetic, there's no beauty in it. You hear them breathing, mumbling, moaning, sometimes screaming, not in unison, not yet. That part comes later, when the resonance alignment begins. Until then, it's chaos, a chorus of broken minds, each lost in its own nightmare, but still bleeding into each other psychically through the cracks. Food is minimal, nutrient slop pumped through wall tubes at irregular intervals. The idea isn't nourishment, it's just maintenance. Keep them alive enough to function. And the guards? Don't expect pity. Most are veterans of other grim assignments: penal legions, black ship escorts, Ordo Xenos retrieval squads. They don't see the choir as people. They call them hollowheads or dead lungs. There's no connection, no names, just schedule rotations and lash protocols in case of dissonance events. If one member breaks the resonance harmony, they're punished, sometimes terminated, sometimes just beaten into silence. Depends on who's supervising. What really cuts deep is that the choir isn't allowed sleep like we know it. Their rest cycles are calculated to prevent deep dreaming, because dreams bring warp contact, and warp contact without control is a liability. So instead of sleep, they get intervals of forced sedation, chemical cocktails that keep the body barely conscious but dull the psychic signal. These windows are short, too short. Most choir members drift in and out of something that's not quite wakefulness and not quite unconsciousness. A gray zone, a twilight of constant pressure, pain, and confusion. There are reports from low-level adepts who've worked in these facilities. Some of them went mad. Others just drank themselves into early graves. They spoke of the way the psychic bleed seeped into the minds of the staff. Guilt, regret, a strange, echoing sadness that clung to them even after they left. One said the worst part wasn't the screaming. It was the moments of silence when the choir would all go still at once, as if listening to something just beyond the veil. Something no one else could hear. But for the choir themselves, no one really knows what they feel. We can guess. Fear, definitely. Pain, constantly. But also something deeper. Resentment, isolation, a kind of existential nausea that comes from knowing you're still alive, still thinking, but not considered real anymore. You're useful, but not valuable. Essential, but not respected. I can't help but wonder how many of them, deep in their shattered minds, remember who they were. Their names, their hopes. Maybe even why they agreed to undergo soulbinding in the first place. That belief in service, in purpose, now twisted into something unrecognizable. And the most disturbing part is that the choir is told they are serving the Emperor, that their pain matters. Some are forced to recite litanies between resonance shifts, chanting praises to the throne as their bodies convulse from psychic overload. A handful might even believe it, might find something like peace in that narrative. But for most, it's slavery, pure and simple, sanctified, justified, institutionalized. There's no honor in this, only endurance. There's a theory that circulates in some inquisitorial circles, a dark one. It suggests that the choir isn't just kept alive because of their resonance utility, but because their suffering creates a certain psychic texture in the warp, that their collective agony somehow fortifies the Imperium's psychic network by providing a stabilizing pain pattern, like tuning a machine with screams instead of gears. It's twisted, but in the grim dark future, the line between science and cruelty is paper thin. So when you hear the term choir of the damned, don't picture a room of ethereal voices singing with dignity into the void. Picture cells filled with hushed sobs and whispered names. Picture broken souls straining to remember who they were before the light of the Emperor cracked them open. Picture people, human beings, who were promised glory and given silence. And understand that the Imperium calls that service. At first glance, it's tempting to ask why the Imperium even bothers keeping the choir of the damned alive. Why not simply execute the broken, the failed, the ones who couldn't become proper astropaths? It would be easier, cleaner, more merciful. But the truth is, the Imperium doesn't operate on mercy. It operates on utility. And these psykers, shattered as they may be, are useful, not as people, not even as minds, but as batteries, as raw psychic fuel. The choir is not just symbolic, it's functional. Every one of its members is a conduit, a pulsing node in a larger circuit of desperation and survival. Their pain, their fractured souls, are exploited to produce something uniquely valuable: psychic resonance. Not clean, Not precise like that of a trained astropath, but strong. Volatile, yes, but that volatility is part of the appeal. Where a soul-bound astropath can send a message across light years with focus and discipline, the choir sends waves of energy like detonations through the warp. Less a whisper and more a scream. You see, when enough psykers are linked together, especially ones that bleed raw emotion through the warp, they begin to amplify each other. It's not just addition, it's exponential. One voice cries, and the others resonate with it, until the chamber becomes a single psychic engine pumping out frequencies that trained minds could never produce, and that energy can be harvested, focused, weaponized. The choir isn't a chorus, it's a reactor. There are entire ships in the Segmentum Obscurus outfitted with choir chambers, their hulls lined with thick adamantium to contain the feedback. These vessels are deployed in high-risk warp lanes where standard astropathic communication fails. Instead of relying on precise signals, they unleash a psychic shockwave that can be picked up by entire networks of listening stations. It's messy, imprecise, but in wartime, when fleets need to coordinate over vast distances and Vox relays are jammed, a scream will do when a whisper won't. Then there's the military application. Some regiments, especially those operating under the Inquisition or Ordo Hereticus, deploy choir-based emitters in planetary campaigns. These constructs, often hidden beneath cathedrals or disguised as relic vaults, house choir nodes tuned to destabilize enemy psykers. Imagine marching into battle and suddenly your head feels like it's caving in, not from any visible force, but because a choir of tortured souls is howling directly into your mind. Sanctioned or not, most psykers can't handle that kind of pressure. The Ordo doesn't care, they just want results. One of the most controversial uses of the choir, at least among those who know it exists, is in anti-demonic containment. When a demon manifests in real space, it brings with it a psychic footprint, a presence that ripples through reality like a tumor. The choir can be tuned to resonate against that footprint, not strong enough to banish a demon outright, but enough to weaken it, to disrupt its cohesion. Picture a room filled with 100 shattered psykers, all screaming the same fragmented hymn, and that hymn makes a bloodletter stagger. That's not fiction, that's field-tested. But here's the part that really gets under my skin. This isn't a desperate improvisation. This is institutionalized. There are manuals, protocols. Entire divisions of the Adeptus Mechanicus and Astra Telepathica work together to refine this system, developing new ways to extract more power from less stable minds. Pain thresholds are mapped. Psychic pain-to-output ratios are logged. Some choirs are kept in states of constant physical agony because the data shows it produces a cleaner frequency. Others are exposed to hypnotic mantras or even blasphemous stimuli because fear and confusion spike resonance in measurable ways. They've turned suffering into a science. And the thing is, it works. That's the most horrifying part. For all its brutality, the choir delivers. Fleets get their messages, enemies fall, demons wail, the Imperium marches on, and in the process it becomes harder and harder to argue that any of this is wrong. Because if it works, if it saves lives, who has the right to object? The psykers? The ones who already failed their only real test? The ones whose minds are so broken, they barely even know what's happening to them. This is where you start to see the full weight of the Imperium's logic. It's not just cruelty, it's calculated cruelty. There's a place for everyone in the machine, and if that place is lying in a dark cell, strapped to a resonance rig, screaming until your lungs burst, well, at least you're serving. At least your death has value. At least you're not forgotten. There's a fan theory I've read that still haunts me. It suggests that the choirs aren't just batteries, they're beacons, that the Imperium places them not just for practical function, but as warnings, signals to the warp itself. "We are here," they cry, not just to allies, but to the horrors beyond. It's a taunt, a declaration. We know you're listening, and we're not afraid to scream. But I think the reality is darker. I think the choirs are proof that the Imperium is willing to use anyone, in any way, for just a little more survival. Not victory, not glory, just survival. A few more years, a few more systems, a few more soldiers making it to the front lines. And if that means burning through 1,000 broken minds to light the way, then so be it. That's the price. That's the song. That's the choir of the damned. This is the part where everything gets uncomfortable, not because of gore or suffering or grimdark cruelty, but because we're forced to ask something the Imperium usually avoids. Do the psykers of the choir of the damned still have souls? Are they still human? And maybe even darker. Were they ever truly saved by the Emperor, or were they just burned a little slower than the rest? It's hard to say. On one hand, these were once people, born on Imperial worlds, selected by the Black Ships, pushed through years of indoctrination and terror. They spoke, loved, feared. They believed. But when the soulbinding went wrong, when their psychic selves were cracked under the Emperor's gaze, something changed. You can see it in their eyes, those who still have them. You can feel it in their presence. They're hollow, but not empty. Like there's still something inside, but it's caged, smothered, barely flickering. The kind of light you'd miss if you weren't really looking. The ecclesiarchy, of course, has their own position on all this. They insist that any psyker touched by the Emperor's will, even in failure, is spiritually sanctified, that their suffering is part of a divine plan, and that their souls are protected from the horrors of the warp by the residual grace of the soulbinding. But that feels convenient, like a theological bandage stretched over something they don't understand. Because if you look at how the choir actually lives, if you listen to the way they scream, it's hard to believe there's anything protected about them. The warp doesn't ignore suffering. It feeds on it. And that's the thing that really terrifies me. These psykers are open. Their minds are broken, their psychic shielding fractured, their essence leaking into the void. They're not just at risk of being attacked. They're vulnerable by design. Choir members spend years, sometimes decades, projecting their pain into the immaterium. What kind of attention do you think that draws? How long before something from the warp starts whispering back? There are fan theories that suggest the choir is more than just a communications tool. It's a gateway. That over time, as the souls of these broken psykers fray and disintegrate, they become doorways for things far worse than failed experiments. Not full demonic possession, at least not immediately, but subtle infiltration. Warped thoughts, corrupted resonance. One choir chamber in the Ultima Segmentum reportedly began singing a hymn that no one recognized in a language no Imperial scribe could decode, a language that made the walls weep blood. The choir was incinerated within hours. The data was sealed. And then there's the question of redemption. Can these psykers be saved? Spiritually? Metaphysically? The Astra Telepathica says no. Once failed, always failed. There's no coming back from a fractured soul binding. But I've read accounts from fringe missionaries, cult priests, sometimes even renegade confessors, who believe otherwise. They think that the choir of the damned are saints in waiting, that their constant agony is a divine sacrifice that cleanses the sins of mankind. To these fringe worshippers, the choir isn't damned, it's exalted. There are even cults, hidden deep in hive cities and orbital stations, that hold secret rituals where they listen for the choir's psychic echoes. They claim these echoes carry fragments of prophecy, that in the distorted static of 1,000 broken minds, the truth about the Emperor's will can be heard. I don't know whether to laugh or shudder at that, but part of me gets it. When you're surrounded by so much cruelty, you start needing to believe that it has meaning, that all this pain leads somewhere. The question of what happens after death is even more agonizing. If the soul is intact, it's said that it returns to the Emperor's light, ascending to some unknowable afterlife where its service is honored. But for the choir, who knows? If their soul was broken by the binding, Then what even dies when they expire? Is it the last flicker of identity? Or just the meat and noise finally going quiet? Are they absorbed into the warp, claimed by demons, or do they drift as echoes forever? Some argue that they become part of the Astronomicon itself, that their final psychic resonance is woven into the Emperor's great beacon. It's a beautiful idea, sure, but maybe too beautiful for this universe. More likely, they just vanish, screamed their last scream and blinked out of existence, unmourned, unremembered. A battery drained, a signal lost. There's a story that stuck with me. A minor tech adept on Mars who claimed to have heard the final breath of a choir singer over a Vox link. He described it not as a scream, but as a sigh, like the end of something old, something tired. And in that moment, he said, he felt something like peace radiating through the machine spirit. He was laughed out of his post for saying it. But I wonder, maybe that's the closest thing the choir ever gets to redemption. Not heaven, not glory, just release. What breaks my heart the most is how few people even ask these questions. Souls are currency in the Imperium. They're weaponized, categorized, judged, but rarely, if ever, are they treated with compassion. And maybe that's the real tragedy of the choir of the damned. Not just that their bodies are used, but that their souls, those fragile, flickering things, are forgotten in the process. Left to drift, to fade, or to scream forever in the dark. There's a saying whispered in the darker corners of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The choir doesn't end at the voice. And if you've spent enough time digging through the scattered testimonies and sealed reports, you start to understand what that really means. Because for some of the most broken psykers, the ones who not only failed the soulbinding, but continued to deteriorate in horrifying, unpredictable ways, the story doesn't stop at screaming. It twists further into flesh and spirit, into mutation, into something the Imperium would rather pretend doesn't exist. Most choir members are maintained just enough to serve their function, and when they falter or begin to destabilize too much, they're disposed of. But not all of them. Some are pulled aside, reassigned, quietly redirected to facilities that don't appear on official maps. You won't find records of these places in open archives, and you won't hear about them in sermons. But they're real. They're where psykers are taken apart. The Mechanicus plays a massive role here, especially certain sects within the Magos Biologists and the Divisio Psychana. These guys don't just want to use psykers, they want to understand them. And choir members, with their damaged minds and flickering warp signatures, are perfect test subjects. Unlike sanctioned psykers, they're not protected by regulation or oath. They're already broken, already condemned. Which means, in the eyes of the Imperium's more inquisitive minds, they're expendable. Some experiments are designed to map the exact boundaries of psychic breakdown. How far can a human mind be pushed before it becomes something else entirely? What patterns of suffering yield the highest warp output? What combination of neurochemical imbalances produces harmonic bleed? These questions aren't hypothetical. They're logged, cross-referenced. Some choir members are dosed with exotic compounds, drugs designed to trigger psychic amplification or even open minor warp rifts through their own pain. Others are surgically altered, parts of their brains removed, organs replaced with psychoreactive implants. One declassified document from a renegade explorator archive described a choir subject who had no skull, just a containment dome filled with amber gel, housing a semi-liquid psychic brain mass. They called it Resonance 12. It survived for 17 days. 17 days of constant, unending projection. And then there are the mutations. No one wants to talk about this, not officially. But it happens. Psychic strain, especially in the presence of warp energy, changes the body. The choir isn't just mentally damaged, they're physically unstable. Some develop tumors that pulse in time with their telepathic emissions. Others grow secondary organs, sensory stalks, subdermal antennae, even rudimentary warp sacs. These aren't just random growths. In some cases, they enhance function. One choir member was recorded producing coherent warp harmonics with no vocal cords at all. The sound came through his skin, vibrating like an instrument. And the worst part, it was clearer than most fully trained astropaths. There are cases, rare of course and always suppressed, of choir members evolving into something unrecognizable, no longer fully human, something between psyker, servitor, and something else, a new category of being. Some call them echo forms. Others, more dramatically, refer to them as chorus demons, even though they're not truly possessed. They're not overtaken by warp entities. They are the entity now, the result of too much strain, too much exposure, and too little humanity left to hold it all together. Theories vary. Some scholars think these mutations are a side effect of proximity to warp echoes, psychic resonance bouncing back and reshaping the host. Others believe the Emperor's light, when incompletely fused with a psyker, creates unstable spirit patterns that eventually burst through the body like an overcharged circuit. And then there's the really heretical stuff, the idea that the choir is evolving on purpose, that these mutations are the first steps toward a new kind of being, not sanctioned, not chaos-touched, but something entirely outside the current structure of psyker classification. It sounds like madness. But when you think about how the Imperium treats these people, burning them, reshaping them, plugging them into machines, maybe madness is exactly what you'd expect. Maybe it's the system that's gone insane, and the choir is just adapting in the only way it can. There are even rogue tech priests and excommunicated psychana adepts who've tried to cultivate these mutations. They see the choir not as a failure state, but as raw material for a new breed of human interface, humans capable of communicating not just across the galaxy, but between dimensions, a human warp beacon that can think and sing simultaneously. Living infrastructure, psychic architecture. It's terrifying, sure, but also kind of inevitable, isn't it? Because the longer you stare at the choir, the more you realize the Imperium doesn't want them to be human anymore. It wants them to be tools. And when a tool starts changing, starts becoming something else, the response isn't to destroy it, it's to test it, log it, replicate it. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that the choir mutates, but that someone somewhere is keeping score, watching the data, waiting to see which transformation will be the most efficient. Because if there's one thing the Imperium does well, it's taking tragedy and turning it into policy, one scream at a time. The weirdest thing about the choir of the damned isn't just what they are, it's how few people ever talk about them. Even among fans, there's something of a dark footnote, a half-whispered concept that appears in one paragraph of a codex or in the margins of a black library novel. And inside the Imperium itself, they're not spoken of at all. Not in sermons, not in training manuals, not in the oaths of the Astra Telepathica. It's like the choir is a collective open secret, known by everyone who needs to know and carefully ignored by everyone else. And that silence says a lot. Because let's be honest, the Imperium is obsessed with sacrifice, with martyrdom, duty, glory and pain. Saints are sculpted into cathedral walls with blades through their hearts and fire in their lungs. The Imperial Creed practically fetishizes suffering. And yet, the choir is never put on a pedestal, never mentioned in heroic tales. Why? Because even by the Imperium's warped standards, this is too much, too raw, too bleak. It's not a clean death in the name of the Emperor. It's a slow, dehumanizing grind. Not the noble end of a martyr, but the ongoing torment of a thing that can't even be allowed to die. Some inquisitors, especially the more radical elements of the Ordo Hereticus, are fully aware of the choir and even defend its use. They argue that in a galaxy as dangerous as this one, such tools are not just necessary, but merciful in their own way. A failed psyker, after all, poses enormous risks. Possession, corruption, warp leakage. Why not contain and utilize them instead of purging outright? These voices tend to be cold, practical, and almost chillingly academic. They speak of the choir not in terms of morality, but in terms of output efficiency and warp stability metrics. its dehumanization hidden under graphs and reports. Others, even within the Inquisition, find the whole concept abhorrent. There are rumors, unverified obviously, of inquisitors who discovered a choir facility and ordered it destroyed on the spot. Not because it was heretical, but because it was too loyal, too obedient. Something about it felt wrong, like the souls inside had been bent so far they no longer cast a shadow. There's an idea, one that makes the rounds in more philosophical circles of the Ordo, that perhaps the choir represents a kind of anti-faith. Not the worship of chaos, but the absolute annihilation of identity in the name of the Emperor. A cautionary tale that no one wants to admit exists. And then there's the reaction of regular Imperial citizens, assuming they ever hear of it. Which, to be clear, they almost never do. The average guardsman doesn't know what the choir is. Neither does the average hive worker, agri-serf, or manufactorum overseer. The Imperium's propaganda machine keeps it all tightly sealed. Because what would people think if they knew that failure as a psyker didn't mean death, but decades of agony locked in a vault, screaming for ships you'll never see? That even after you've been broken, burned, and discarded, the Imperium will still squeeze whatever is left of you into something useful. Among the few who do know, opinions are wildly divided. Some see the choir as sacred, a form of penance, even if unintended. Their suffering is interpreted as the Emperor's justice, a grim mercy that turns their shame into service. There are shrines, rare and illegal, dedicated to the choir in the underhives of certain hive cities. Little alcoves filled with candles, broken vox units playing distorted echoes of static and warbling psychic feedback. They call them the Weeping Saints, the last choir, saints of the silent note. Saints. On the opposite end, you've got those who see the choir as filth, as dangerous, mutated remnants that should have been incinerated the moment they failed their soul-binding. To these people, the choir isn't holy. It's a contamination risk, a spiritual infection held barely in check by bureaucracy and blind hope. There are even reports of rogue ecclesiarchy cells that go out of their way to sabotage choir facilities, claiming divine mandate. They say that letting these husks exist mocks the Emperor's will, that true loyalty would be to end their misery. And in the middle of all this, us, the fans, the lore nerds, the readers who find these one-line mentions and start pulling on the thread, asking what kind of galaxy could create something like this and call it necessary. I've had heated debates with friends over it. Some think the choir are tragic heroes, unrecognized martyrs keeping the Imperium alive one scream at a time. Others think they're just victims, stripped of any agency or honor, and used in the worst way imaginable, silently. What strikes me most is how deliberate the silence is. The Imperium could easily turn the choir into a symbol, give them names, paint murals of their faces etched in gold. But it doesn't, because it knows. It knows that if people started thinking too much about these broken psykers, started feeling for them, then questions would follow. Dangerous questions. And the Imperium doesn't like questions. It likes obedience. It likes silence. So instead, the choir stays hidden, not just in vaults and catacombs, but in the dark corners of the lore itself. They're there if you look closely. A name here, a term there, but never in focus. Always blurred, always just out of reach. Maybe that's fitting. Maybe that's what makes them the most Warhammer thing of all. Not the screaming, not the mutations, not even the horror of their purpose, but the fact that they are absolutely essential to the Imperium's survival, and no one wants to admit they exist. There's one aspect of the Choir of the Damned that sticks with me more than any other. Not the screaming, not the mutations, not even the warp experimentation. It's the silence after. The moment when the resonance fades, when the last psychic pulse disappears into the void, and the chamber just goes quiet. That silence isn't peace. It's not relief. It's a vacuum. And it makes you wonder, what happens to the memory of these people? What happens to who they were? The Imperium, of course, doesn't remember them. It doesn't have time for that. There are trillions of souls under its dominion, and the machine only runs if it forgets most of them. But we remember, the fans, the readers, the ones who catch that half line in a rule book or the footnote in an Inquisitor's report. The ones who stumble across the word choir in a data fragment and go digging. Because once you know they exist, you can't unknow it. It gets under your skin. And the more you think about them, the more you start to see them everywhere. In the background, in the edges of missions, in the psychic bleed behind Vox transmissions. The choir is never front and center. They haunt the margins, and that makes them feel more real than almost anything else in the setting. There's something deeply personal about how forgotten they are. We all have this instinct to look for meaning in suffering, especially in a universe like Warhammer, where everything is already so bleak. And when the system is as monstrous as the Imperium, the human brain kind of needs to believe there's a reason, that there's structure to the horror. But with the choir, that instinct betrays you, because there's no vindication, no catharsis. These people don't get closure. They don't get revenge. They just exist in pain, and then they don't, and the galaxy moves on. Some fans have proposed this idea that maybe the choir is part of a larger hidden plan, that the Emperor, in his infinite foresight, allowed this system to persist not just out of necessity, but as part of some divine calibration, tuning the warp, bleeding psychic static into the void to weaken chaos itself. It's a poetic theory, and maybe there's comfort in that. Maybe it would be easier to believe that the choir's screams are doing something noble, something cosmic, that their agony is the secret rhythm that keeps the stars turning. But others, myself included, think that's giving the Imperium too much credit. The truth is probably more mundane and way more disturbing. The choir exists not because it's part of a plan, but because no one stopped it. Because it works. Because it's easier to sacrifice the broken than to design something better. Because in a system that never values the individual, a malfunctioning soul becomes just another resource stream. You're not failed. You're rerouted. What really gets me is imagining what the choir might have felt if they ever had a moment of clarity left. Did they understand what had become of them? Did they remember what they were trained for? Duty, service, communion with the Emperor, and realize they'd been repurposed into something grotesque? Did any of them fight it? Or did they just let it happen, resigned to whatever fate the Imperium offered, because they'd already given everything and had nothing left to hold on to? There's a passage, buried in an old Black Library short story, that describes a choir chamber not through its sounds, but through its smell. The staleness, the sweat, the metallic tang of psychic discharge and human decay. The kind of space where you can feel the air pushing back against you, thick with emotion that's been echoing off the walls for decades. That description shook me, because it reminded me that the choir isn't abstract, it's corporeal, it's bodies, minds, nerves, breaths. These people aren't ghosts, they're still there, present in every pulse of energy, even if no one wants to acknowledge them. And that, to me, is the ultimate tragedy of the choir. They're not monsters. They're not villains. They're not even warning signs. They're just people who fell short in the most terrifying place imaginable, and instead of being cared for, they were turned into infrastructure. I don't know how anyone can look at that and not feel something. Even in a setting like Warhammer, where hope is rare and death is routine, the choir still stands out as uniquely cruel, because they survived. And in surviving, they lost everything else. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if someone did try to save them. Not rescue them physically, that ship sailed long ago, but redeem them in the eyes of the Imperium. What if a rogue Inquisitor started spreading stories of the choir's sacrifice? What if shrines were built, litanies written, rituals performed in their name? What if the Emperor, in his incomprehensible will, actually listened to their songs? Would that change anything? Or would the machine simply adapt, file the ritual under useful morale booster, and keep extracting the same suffering? We'll probably never know. But that's why we tell these stories. That's why we write and theorize and imagine. Not because we think we can change the lore, but because somewhere, deep down, we want to remember. We want to hold on to the names the Imperium erased. We want to scream for those who were only ever allowed to scream for someone else. And maybe, in doing that, we keep a little spark of humanity alive, not just in the setting, but in ourselves. Maybe that's the real value of the Choir of the Damned. Not in what they do or what they suffer, but in the fact that we still care. And in this universe, that's not a small thing. That's resistance. That's defiance. That's a whisper in a storm of silence. And sometimes, that's all we get. The story of the Choir of the Damned doesn't end with some grand finale. There's no last stand, no rescue, no quiet redemption. It just continues, echoing endlessly beneath the surface of a civilization that prides itself on endurance and sacrifice, but rarely stops to ask what those words actually cost. These psykers, broken by the very process that was supposed to elevate them, don't get statues or hymns. They get chambers, wires, sedation, screams, and silence. Always silence outside the walls, because their story isn't just uncomfortable, it's indicting. That's why I keep coming back to them. Not just as a strange footnote in the lore, but as something more. A cracked mirror held up to the Imperium itself. Because for all its gothic grandeur, the Imperium is built on a single truth. People don't matter. Not as individuals. Not as souls. What matters is function. You are what you can do, what you can give. And when that's over, when your usefulness ends, you're either recycled or forgotten. The choir exists at the grotesque edge of that logic. It's not just that they were broken. It's that their very brokenness became a resource. Their failure became a utility. And in that utility, they became something less than human, and maybe something more. Not in a transcendent sense, but in a terrifyingly honest one. The choir is what happens when a system values survival above all else. It's what happens when the line between faith and machinery, between sanctity and exploitation, disappears entirely. When the Emperor's light becomes just another voltage to harness. The choir doesn't scream for glory. They scream because they have to, because someone told them to, because someone found a way to make it useful. Some fans argue that this is just another part of the setting's brilliance, that the choir, like servitors or penal legions or lobotomized tithe workers, is one more gear in the horrific engine that is the Imperium. And I get that. Warhammer 40,000 isn't meant to be comfortable. It's not a universe of heroes, it's a warning. But I think the choir goes beyond even that, because it's not just a warning about tyranny or faith or bureaucracy. It's a warning about what happens when empathy dies. The choir isn't evil. That's the part that hurts the most. They didn't turn to chaos. They didn't betray the Emperor. They tried. They stepped into the soul-binding chamber, just like every other astropath. They wanted to serve, to help, to matter. And they failed, not by choice, but by fate. And instead of mercy or rest or even respectful death, they were turned into instruments, stripped of names, wired into walls, pressed into suffering like wax into a mold. And the system that did this to them never blinked, because in the grand calculus of the Imperium, they still worked, still screamed, still had a measurable psychic output, and that was enough. What makes the story of the choir important, what makes it stick in your chest long after you've put the books down, is that it forces you to confront the cost of survival, not in numbers, not in body counts, but in humanity, in identity, in souls. We talk a lot about how grimdark the setting is, but the choir isn't just grim or dark, it's hollow, a hole where a person used to be. And the fact that the Imperium doesn't see that as a tragedy, but as efficiency, tells you everything you need to know about the world we're dealing with. Some people see the choir and feel horror, others feel pity, a few even feel admiration. I think all of those are valid. I think what matters is that we feel something at all. Because if there's one tiny shard of humanity left in the galaxy of Warhammer 40,000, Maybe it's found in those of us who can still look at the choir and care, who can still be bothered to remember the names that were erased, who still think suffering should mean something. And maybe that's all we get. Not salvation, not justice, but memory. That somewhere out there, in the endless dark, a voice is still screaming, and we choose not to look away. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself thinking about the lives behind the noise, then maybe it's time we talked about more of them. Because in Warhammer 40,000, there are always more voices in the dark. So don't forget to subscribe, because we're only just beginning to uncover what lies beneath the surface of the Imperium's silence. And sometimes, the echoes that come back are louder than you'd ever expect.